Hi, folks. As you know, I'm Steve Wilson-Briggs. I'm back with the distinguished and revered Florian Shasky, the librarian here at Sequoia High School. He's agreed to give me a second interview. I was hoping that he would tell some of the stories that he's privileged me with over the few years that I've really come to know him while I've been here at Sequoia. And I also wanted to, in our last interview, we talked a little bit about some of his visions or concerns about libraries and the future, their integration with technology, and so I was hoping that he would share some of those and some other thoughts. So without belaboring things too much more, I'm going to go right to Florian, and I kind of want to just jump in, and we are going to jump right into some of those anecdotal interesting experiences, the intersections that he's had with history. Yeah, so without saying much more, Florian, Mr. Shasky, thank you so much for this second chance.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity to be here and to visit with you again. So, yeah, we'll see what we can do.
So, in our private conversations about your life and your kind of distinguished, interesting career as a librarian, bookseller, book collector, you might be reluctant to accept the charge, but I might suppose you might be a bibliophile to some extent or whatever. But in that path, there were some neat stories. And so I was hoping that you would kind of share some of those.
Yes, did you have any in mind in particular?
There's a few. Some of them, your experiences while you were the librarian at Stanford University, there were some cross sections that you had. I was particularly interested in the Ted Morgan experience. There's a few others, but that might be a cool place to start because there's a real history, cross section of history, law, literature, and so if you don't mind, that might be a fun place to start.
Yes. One minor detail. I was not the librarian at Stanford. Mr. David C. Weber was the librarian. I was the chief of special collections, so I was responsible for rare books and manuscripts, just to be clear on that. Some people might misinterpret that, and I don't want that to happen. Ted Morgan. He's still alive. I think he's 84 years old today, or not today, but right now, 84 years old. And we've been in touch recently, actually, and I can get to that. But I know that you want to know about the Somerset Maugham story. Yeah. Ted Morgan is a very accomplished journalist, he's a writer. He does a lot of historical research. He's written biographies of Roosevelt, Churchill, William S. Burroughs, and he's written other historical works as well. He's an excellent writer. So he came to Stanford and he said, I'm writing a biography of Somerset Maugham, and I understand that the university has some correspondence of Somerset Maugham that is not available. Can you help me out? And I said, certainly. So I looked into the Somerset Maugham correspondence. It was under seal. In those days, they were very cautious about protecting the rights of people and so forth. I guess they are today too, but I think it was a little bit too much in those days, maybe. So anyway, I looked into why this collection was under seal, under wraps, and not available for scholars to access and to utilize and to work with the material. And the more I dug into it, the more I realized that an administrator at the university many, many years ago had decided that since the correspondence was between two single men, that there might be something in it that would be a little off color or offensive. I don't know what he had in mind. So he sealed it. So I took this information. I got permission to actually look at the letters to make sure that there was nothing scandalous or nothing that would provide any problems for anybody. And as a result of that, we were able to get a court order to undo the seal and make the mom letters available. And Mr. Ted Morgan was the first person to see these letters and to use them in his biography. And the letters were quite important in a way. They told stories about Somerset Maugham that no one had ever had known, including being in the jungles of South America, being on a boat, the boat tipping over, and being saved by native Indians in that area. No one knew about that story. So little anecdotes like that that turned up. And Ted Morgan and I became friends, and we're still friends today. But that is a very poignant encounter that I had with him. But it does demonstrate that you have to be not only curious but determined when you're working on things and not just give up.
I'm forgetting the personality's name, but you were part of the sleuth work that it took to apprehend kind of an international investigation.
Yes.
And I'm forgetting his name, and I'm terribly sorry. So I'm going to pass. I'm certain you know this, one of the stories that I'm talking about.
Yes, I do. The name is James Wilson Mull.
Thank you.
And he was a hanger-on, if you will, at the classics department at Stanford while I was there in the library. And he would come to the library 3 or 4 times a week and spend an inordinate amount of time at the card catalog. In those days, we actually had 3x5 cards in drawers in the oak cabinets, which are very desirable today. So anyway, he would be going through these cards, and I observed that this behavior was not quite right for some reason. In other words, you can go through the cards to find a book and so on, but he spent more time and had very little to produce in terms of saying, I wanted this book or that book to read in the room. So I made a note of it, and I also informed the sheriff's department, which was responsible for security at the university. So that was that. And then some months went by, and he just disappeared. We don't know where he was. Well, we found out later that he went to San Francisco, and he went to a very high-end bookshop on Post Street, John Howell Books, and he paid $1,000 for a fine press edition of Thucydides, I think it was. Anyway, the bookseller was very impressed that a young man would come in with $1,000 cash and buy a book. So when this fellow went around to other bookstores in San Francisco and they contacted John Howell Books, he had a good reputation because he'd made this purchase. So that was all part of his cunning plan to curry favor and then to do some things that were not nice at all. And what he did was to sneak into parts of the library that are not open to the public, and he changed locks and changed the chains that were around and so on, and was able to figure out when the alarms went on and off. And he stole a number of rare books. And that was a disaster for a while. And we found out about it because he took some of the rare books to San Francisco and tried to sell them to a bookseller who incidentally had just sold one of the titles to us a year earlier, and he recognized it. So he called me and he said, by the way, someone has just come in here to sell to me a book I sold to you, to the library at the university, a year ago. We find this very suspicious. And I said, well, please stall him, and then I'll call the police, and if you can't, and we'll see if we can't nab him. Well, he panicked. He sensed that there was something up. The bookseller got nervous, and he ran out and put the books on top of his car to open the car door and sped off when the books flew off. So we had some evidence that those books were stolen books. And he fled to Europe, and so the grand chase was on, and it involved Scotland Yard and Interpol and the U.S. Postal Inspectors and the FBI and all kinds of people. So he tried to sell books at Sotheby's in London. They didn't want to play with him on that. He fled to Greece, and he was spotted by a Stanford professor on leave in Greece. It was quite a saga of moving around and tracking this man. Finally, he went to Switzerland, and he committed a huge crime by not paying his hotel bill in Switzerland. That's a big no-no, I am told. So he ran out, and they chased him, and they got him, and they checked him through all the databases, and certainly there were warrants, international wants and warrants for him. So they captured him, and then the sheriff came to me, and the sheriff said, well, we've got him. And I said, make sure you go through his pockets, his backpack, and I want a record of every piece of paper that he has, every document that he has, because I had a suspicion about what he had done with the books. And sure enough, they found a very small ticket, which was a storage ticket, and there was no name on it. But I recognized that it was probably San Francisco. And so I said, call around to Lyons and other places like that. The San Francisco police did make the calls, and within about 2 or 3 hours, they located the storage unit where he had his material. We went up there, and the gentleman said, well, I'm glad you're here, because tomorrow we were going to sell off all of this material because he hasn't paid his bill in 3 months. So we were very fortunate, and indeed the stolen books were there. I identified them. And we went to court, and I testified and so on. He went to prison, and while in prison, I guess he made friends with some unsavory types. And I got a call from the DA saying that he has threatened you. Just be very careful. So I took that seriously, and I was very careful. About 1.5 years later, I heard that he had been transferred from one prison to another, and he was in an altercation, and someone had stabbed him and killed him. So that was the end of that story.
As I recall, the threats were so credible that you actually had to relocate?
I moved around a lot, yes, indeed. And I was very careful, moved around a lot, and it was scary at first, but you get used to that kind of thing. He also had something called Mull's Meteorite Service. He was buying and selling meteorites, pieces of meteorite that were genuine meteorites, pieces that he picked up from dealers in Russia. And early on, I should have mentioned in the chronology, early on, the sheriff's department realized that he had rented a small house in an unincorporated area of Redwood City. And so they went out and raided the place, and they allowed me to come along. And once they secured the premises, they allowed me to come in. And it was a real mess. And it was just junk all over the place, and meteorite stuff, but no rare books. And so they said, well, I guess this is just futile. I said, no. I said, turn the mattresses over. So they did, and under the mattress he had hidden the cards from the library catalog. And so that was even further evidence of what was missing. So that was all part of the sleuthing too, which we did.
Now, a moment ago, this is probably an awkward tangent, but a moment ago you mentioned Russia, which kind of jogged my mind. For a while, you came into the possession of a very interesting collection of I think it was KGB literature. And I was hoping you might tell the story about how that acquisition occurred. I kind of love that tale.
Well, these stories frequently begin with a call very late at night or very early in the morning, an anonymous call. So I was back in the book trade at that point, and I did get a call, and the caller said, there's a collection of books and magazines and other things at this location in this luxury apartment on the peninsula. Would you please go there and clean everything out? And you have 24 hours to do this. And I said, sure, I'll do that. So I went over there just by myself. I was not allowed to have anybody else with me. I can do it. So I had boxes and wrapping material and cleaning material and everything else. So I got everything out of there in the allotted time and took it back to my shop and my warehouse and started going through it. And I realized that the main collection of books in this collection consisted of early spy manuals and tradecraft manuals relating to pre-KGB operations and then KGB operations, also German intelligence and French and European intelligence services. So the person who had this collection was a serious collector and had language skills, I think, to be able to collect this kind of material. So I immediately called the Hoover Institution because I said, I thought to myself, they might be able to use this. And they were very happy to hear from me and to know about this collection. And they said, well, send over a list, which I did. They checked it, and they had all but 3 items. Their collections are so vast and so wonderful and so complete in many ways. So they said, well, we want to buy those 3 items. And I said, no, I don't want to dilute this collection. I'm going to sell it as a collection, which I did to an institution on the East Coast. So that was that. And then a few years after that, I was in the Hamptons at a party, Max Lerner. I was packing Max Lerner's library, which I'd sold to a university in the Southwest. He said, you've been working hard. I'm going to take you to some parties in the Hamptons. Get in the car, we're going to go see some wonderful people, which we did. And he introduced me to a retired professor and said, you and so-and-so have a lot in common. You love books. And the professor said, tell me, what was the most important book you've ever handled? And I said, well, it's not a question of the most important book, but rather the most important, significant, unusual collection that passed through my hands. And he said, what is that? And I said, well, it's a collection of intelligence manuals and KGB material. He said, where did you get it? And I told him the story. And he said, who was the owner? I said, well, the owner was killed on El Camino in a hit-and-run accident. It was written up in the papers. He said, what's the name? And I mentioned the name, Edward Ellis Smith. And he said, oh my God, I haven't heard that name in a while. He said, I was his case officer and I had 24 hours to get him out of Moscow because he was compromised with a female agent, KGB agent, and we had to get him out for his own safety. So, small world, I guess, is a tag for that one.
Thanks so much for these stories. There's others that I love, and there might be certain details that I'm lucky enough to know that might have accidentally been omitted. One being from the Ted Morgan story. As I recall, I think he saved you and your daughter in a swimming, but I won't walk walk us back there. But I so appreciate these. I'm wondering if there's one more that you might be willing to share with us before we turn a corner.
Well, there were a lot of collections, and this is one of the things that I did with my company that other booksellers were not necessarily doing. I would acquire collections of professors, writers, historians, and so on, libraries, scholars' libraries, and list them pretty much, and then catalog them, of course, and then offer them out to institutions in this country and beyond. And I established a rather good relationship with a Japanese firm. They were buying libraries and collections of history and sociology in particular. So I set up a system where we would send a container quarterly over to Japan of academic books. And that worked out very, very well. And then, of course, as you know, over the years, the Japanese economy slid downward, and that whole process and that whole activity basically came to a halt. So handling collections like that was great fun, and I enjoyed it very, very much. I had a set of the Diderot Encyclopedia, which was fun to handle. So things like that. And I also got a collection of Bibles with another bookseller, Richard Weatherford, sorry. And we produced the very first video catalog of rare books for sale in this country. That was a pioneering event that we did. So, yes, there was more material.
Some of this is even new to me. So I'm going to turn a corner back to our last interview. We touched on some of your thoughts and concerns about the future of libraries and how they integrate and interface with technology. And so I was hoping that I might just ask you to jump right in and share some of those.
Sure, and some of this might be repetitive from the last interview. I'm not quite sure, but I do have definite thoughts about it. I'm not against technology. I'm actually for technology. And I think it's been very helpful, is very helpful, and will continue to be helpful. But in terms of using technology for research with our students, for example, I insist that they have a balance of books and bytes, B-Y-T-E-S. And it's difficult for them to sort of get off the computer because they're so entwined with video games and social media and everything else that goes through the computer. So it's a habit, and it's very easy for them to do. It's not easy for them to go to a shelf and pull off a reference book, an Oxford University Press reference, and look up something that they need, which they can find, and they will know that it's genuine, legitimate, and not something that's faked. They have difficulty because they have the habit of finding things in the visual reign rather than in the domain of print and so on. So that has become an issue. Another issue that has been apparent to me is that students will find electronic sources, and they will document these sources using the MLA, Modern Language Association style sheet, which we promote here, and that's fine. And then they will go back and try and find those sites, and they can't find them. They've either disappeared, or for some reason, they're just not searching correctly, and they've lost the site if they want to check on something. I've also seen cases where these electronic sources just disappeared and didn't exist after 6 months or so. Whereas if they found the information in printed books, and similar sources, they probably would be able to fairly easily find what they had looked at before. And we hoped that the books would not disappear and be so hard to find. So there's that whole axis that's going on as well. I think also there's another fine point. Material that is produced electronically, especially literary material, it's very hard sometimes to determine what is the first printing, if you will, of a novel written by an author, and the second or the third printing, because they may appear to be all the same because they're printed out from a computer or a disc or whatever. Whereas in the traditional years before, with typewriters and manuscripts and so on, it was relatively easy to find out the progression of the text of the from manuscript to typescript to proof and so on. And that's not easy to do like it used to be. So that's another concern. I may have mentioned this before, but I'm worried about the preservation of material that's stored electronically. I think that books that were printed in the 15th century, they still exist, and I'm not sure that, and when the same amount of time passes, whether these electronic sources are going to be able to be stable and to be preserved. So that's another concern that I have. It's also very difficult sometimes to find the subject entries for material that appears in digital form. It's somewhat easier, I think, to find it in printed sources, the subject headings. And when I mentioned the Library of Congress subject heading system and the reference book that goes along with it, the students kind of just say, what's that? But they need to be aware of that. The other thing that is an issue is the fact that today students have to be familiar with and be able to travel in research ways. In the early period of manuscripts, of the early printed era, hand press era, and then the machine printing era, which is different, and now the digital age. So they need to be able to work and do research in those different platforms. Whereas before, when you and I were going to school, why, there weren't those many options. We didn't have the digital domains and to have to work through those. So students, even though there's more out there available, they're having trouble finding things. And of course, there's a new phrase now, paywall, that comes up. That is to say, there is more information available. Well, there's more information produced, I should say, but there's less available to researchers and to students in particular, in many cases, because they have to pay for it. Fortunately, many schools do have the funds to be able to afford to purchase or lease on an annual basis a database that contains journals and magazines and monographs and even books that the students can access to use in their research. JSTOR, JSTOR is one of the ones that we like, but there's EBSCO and there's others as well. So now it's become a commercial venture, whereas before information was for the most part free unless you wanted to photocopy a page, that kind of thing. So that's made a big difference. And I tell the students that the people that are putting together these databases are making decisions for you based on what they think you might be seeking. Whereas back in the day, what was going on is everything was out there, or almost everything was out there, and you, the researcher, could decide what you wanted to pick and choose. Now the choices are more limited in a way. Having said that, of course, we have Google Books, and I think their goal is to copy every printed book on the planet, and that's an admirable goal. And now I think things are free, but I will predict that somewhere along the line they will start charging for access to some of the material that they have copied. And even in the copying, they're not always accurate, so it's best to see the original because they forget and leave out things, and I've demonstrated that to students before. So those are some of the things that concern me. I also think it's exciting because I can see technology being utilized with students in research where they will be able to connect directly to the writers who produce the material, and that there will be instant communication going back and forth. And I think that would be a great benefit. So, I think also through technology, students are becoming more international, and so the technology is allowing them to communicate with libraries and scholars and writers abroad as well as just in the local pond. And I think that's a great benefit to extend things on an international basis.
Now, I haven't been fortunate enough to witness it with my own eyes, but I know you lecture and teach on methods and techniques of conducting research.
Yes.
Here and other places. And so I was hoping you might talk a little bit about that and maybe share student responses to that, if you would.
Sure. Well, I start off by saying, pay attention and don't ask any questions until I say that you can ask questions. If you really need to ask a question, write it down and then see me when I'm free in the library, and I'll help you with the question. But right now, you don't know enough about what we're doing to be able to ask questions, and that's why we're here, to be able to give you some training and some guidance on how to become connoisseurs of information. But until you reach that stage, just please listen up. I will ask the questions, you will have the answers. And that's a little bit of an adjustment for them, but it happens. And then we bring in primary sources, which is another thing that students normally don't have access to. Now, they can see, quote, primary sources on the internet if they go, for example, to the American Memory section of the Library of Congress collections. They have an excellent display and collection of letters of our founders of our nation and all kinds of primary sources, but they're digital, they're electronic. And that makes a difference when you see it on a flat screen. So when I bring in a letter of James Madison, they see it and they have a totally different reaction because it does look different from the James Madison letter that they saw on the screen. And so we have collections of letters and manuscripts and so on, which we provide for students, because those who are going on to college and university will be exposed to that material in any case. So we're showing them these things at the high school level. These are primarily international baccalaureate students, of course. But on the other hand, all students have access to them. We don't just limit them to the baccalaureate students. Any student who has an interest, they can use the material. So we have a very fine collection of unpublished Civil War letters that talks about farming in the South during the Civil War and the cotton industry and so forth, and slavery. Very, very open letters about students, young children going to school. We have that. We have a collection of Gold Rush letters And we have a ship's log, an 18th century log of a ship, the brig Columbia, which sailed out of the East Coast. And they're fascinated by seeing these things. It's unpublished as well, this ship's log. But we want to bring these things to them to show them the reality of what's out there. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Are there any particular individual responses that might stand out?
Wow. Is it real? How much did it cost?
Things like that.
Those are sort of typical responses.
Okay.
And about the how much it costs, it's priceless.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about the Robert C. Powell grant. But before, part of the reason that I do I'm doing these interviews with you is, one, I find you fascinating. I love your background, and I know that one day you're going to turn your keys in, and you're gonna enjoy your private life. And you might not come around here. And so this is my way of digitizing you and preserving you for myself and others, because they won't have the original source one day. Hopefully that day is, years away. And so I want to share, before we do that, I want to share one of my favorite memories of you. And that was graduation day, 2013. A group of about 5 students. I came. Graduation day is summer.
Yes.
And so for us, it's the beginning of summer. And so I went around to say my goodbyes. And so I stopped by to say goodbye to you for the summer. And there was a group of about 5 students in front of me that came down to say their goodbyes, their permanent goodbyes, unless they happen to come by some years later. And the last of these students, and that was kind of moving and touching, and great honor to witness. But there was one student at the end, he was giving a very full goodbye, but you were imparting information about getting a job at a hardware store somewhere. We all need our first job, even if we're going off to college and stuff like that. And so he was getting that information, and you were kind of telling him who to talk to and how to present himself best. And that was just, for some reason, it was a beautiful moment. So I don't know if there's a need to respond. I just want to share that with you and stuff. Turning it out.
There are a lot of, if I may, there are a lot of moments like that, and some of the moments like that are even more touching in a way. And there's one in particular, and I'm hesitant to tell you the story because it still affects me so strongly. I'm interested in literacy. I'm interested in young people who have not a great grasp of language and literature and reading, to help them come along and to provide books and things for them that will bring them along. I mean, graphic novels, for example, and so on. A few years ago, a philanthropic organization in the East Bay provided some funding for us to take English language learner students over to the bookstore across the street. And the students could pick out a book that they would go to the counter and purchase, and the money had already been allocated and so forth. And teachers were there, and I was invited to come along to help. So we would look at the book to make sure that it was appropriate reading and everything else. And I participated in that with 2 or 3 other teachers. So we went over and we did that, and toward the end of the whole process, there was a young lady who picked out a book, and she was clutching the book really strongly. And she went to the counter, and it was processed, and it was given to her. And then she went off in a corner, and she started crying. And so I told one of the lady teachers, I said, maybe there's a problem with this young girl, and please see how she is. if she needs some attention of some kind. So the teacher went over and talked to her and came back and said, she's okay. She's just overwhelmed by the fact that she's never owned a book before.
That's yeah, that means a lot.
And you know, we take these things for granted. See, we just, you know, it's think nothing of getting a paperback or getting a book. I don't remember exactly my first book that I ever purchased. I do know the first rare book that I purchased because that was a big event in my life. But I just was so taken by that. And I like to think about that story because it just emphasizes the need to pay attention to little details like that. And, you know, she took that book home, and that might have been the only book in the house. Who knows? But she had a book.
I love that story. The story's meaningful on a lot of levels. One of the things that levels that it's so meaningful to me is working here at Sequoia. When you come into Carrington Hall, you might look around and think that Sequoia, we do have beautiful facilities here, it's a beautiful campus, but we serve a student population. Some of the kids do come from affluent, comfortable homes, but the majority of our students come from more modest means, and some extremely modest. And it's always extremely heartening, the level of appreciation that people might not know exists in some of our kids. And sometimes it's just absolutely stunning and always beautiful.
Well, now you mentioned Carrington Hall, if I may. There's another anecdote that I haven't told you about that I think will fascinate you. And a few years ago, I saw a couple of gentlemen coming through the tea garden. And so I opened the doors going out from the library to the tea garden, and I said, may I help you? And they said, oh, we're just looking around. And there were three gentlemen. There was a tall gentleman and then two senior men who were a little shorter. So I invited them to come in, obviously. And they introduced themselves, and they said, well, we were just looking around, and so here's a graduate of Sequoia, and he hasn't been back here for 40 years or so, something like that. So I was able to get a hold of the principal at the time, which was Bonnie Hansen, and she came and joined the group. And we had a little brief tour around the main building. And then I suggested we go into Carrington Hall, which we did. And I led the group up to the top in the back. And I could tell that the one gentleman who was having some trouble walking before, all of a sudden got a really lively gait, and he just almost charged up to the back upstairs there. And he just stood there for a while. Then he smiled and he turned to us and he said, that's where it all started. That's where it happened. And we kind of looked puzzled. And I think he sensed that we were puzzled, and it was kind of a mystery. And he said, that is where I was able to experiment with sound. Well, you can imagine who he was. Ray Dolby.
Oh, that's incredible. Wow.
He was thrilled. Something simple like that. He was just thrilled. So moments like that are just fantastic, and they happen all the time around here, all the time.
There's an important story, a couple important stories that I want to get to. And so one of them is the kind of origin story and the role that you played in kind of acquiring or securing the Robert C. Powell grant,
Yes.
Which is like extremely helpful. It's a very big deal.
Yes.
Here at Sequoia High School.
Yes.
It plays a lot of our funding, a lot of resources that we have in the Sequoia Library are due to that. There's other services, and there's also a college, I think two college scholarships that are offered through that. And so I was hoping that you would share.
Sure. Robert C. Powell was a graduate of Sequoia back in the late 40s. And I met him because his secretary called me one day. I didn't know him prior to this at all. She called and she said, Mr. Powell is missing his alumni bulletin, his newsletter. Could you look into it and find out what's going on? So I did. And I got a copy and I sent it to him by express mail and so on. So I just built up a relationship by sending him things. I would send him a yearbook, and I would have Miss Marchbank sign the yearbook to Mr. Robert C. Powell, compliments of the Sequoia and so on. So we built up this relationship, and I kept saying to his secretary, I'd like to meet Mr. Powell. And she said, well, he's a quiet person, which was another way of saying he's somewhat of a recluse. He and his wife had no children, but after high school and so on, he became a builder and a developer, and he built huge shopping centers as well as luxury tract homes and so on. Maybe a luxury tract is maybe a contradiction, I'm not sure. In any case, he amassed a fortune. And finally, I was able to get an audience with him in the middle of August. And I drove up to Sacramento area and went to his offices. He was very, very cordial, a real gentleman, excellent. And so we sat down, and I brought with me a copy of our WASC report. We'd just been through the experience of being reviewed by the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. So I brought a color printed copy of that and put it on the table for him, and he said, that certainly is a lot different than when I went to Sequoia. And I said, well, I'm leaving this with you. I want you to go through it and see it if you wish, to see how your school has developed and thrived. And he said, I appreciate that very much. And then he said, by the way, he said, tell me about yourself. So I did. And he was happy to hear that I'd been in construction and happy to hear that I had a life of books and so on as well. And he said, you know, you really do sound enthusiastic about Sequoia. And I said, I'm extremely enthusiastic about Sequoia. He said, that's good to hear. He said, I think we, meaning Mrs. Powell and himself, we can do something for you. And I said, well, we would appreciate that. Then he said, what do you need? And I mentioned the baccalaureate program and the need for funding for special programs and for books to supply the students for research purposes and so on. So he said, fine. He said, I think we can do something for you. And then that was the end of the visit. I sent him a thank you letter, and he sent a check for $10,000. And I thought, wow, that's extraordinary. We have a check from $10,000. So I called and thanked him again and didn't hear from him. And then about a year and a half later, I received a letter from his accountant and his lawyers who said that he had passed away, but that he and his wife had bequeathed to Sequoia the sum of $1 million and 2 scholarships, full ride scholarships in perpetuity for 2 of our students every year to the University of Pacific. And that was a major gift. So we have the money in an endowment. It's invested properly and so on. It's been very, very helpful in putting together extra credit, if you will, programs for the baccalaureate students by bringing in speakers, artists, and internships. Mr. Powell said, do you have a work-study program? And I explained what we had as the equivalent of that. He said, fine, that's great. So I think it's one of the largest, if not the largest, gift that has been given by an individual to Sequoia in the history of the school, when you consider not just the $1 million, but also the 2 scholarships in perpetuity. So that's the short version of the Powell story.
He also included you, didn't he include you in kind of how that money would be allocated, spent?
Yes, he did. He stipulated that I meet with, in his will, that I meet with the lawyers and the accountants to work with them on the wording for how it was to be spent, and I just participated in that, yes.
I started thinking about interviewing you maybe a long time ago, well, a year or so ago when I started thinking about doing these. But that process was accelerated 4 or 5 months ago when I noticed that physically you were having some ambulatory problems and you were experiencing some health problems. And it was probably, I'm certain it was difficult for you, but it was also difficult for a lot of the people here at work that care about you. And so I started thinking about doing some interviews with you. So anyway, I was hoping you might talk a little bit about the health problems that you had recently.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting story in a way, and I'm happy to mention it because perhaps something of what I say will help somebody else, because I don't want anyone to have to go through what I went through. February 18th, I was admitted to Sequoia Hospital. I was feeling very poorly, very weak, and it took them 3 days and 7 doctors and the staff to find out what was wrong with me. And they realized that I had an infection, and the infection had spread to my mitral valve, which had produced a vegetation on the valve, which is not good. And also it had spread to my brain, and there was sort of vegetation in the brain as well, which caused me lots of problems. I had trouble writing. I couldn't read my own name when I wrote it out. So they put me on massive antibiotics, and that course of antibiotics got rid of the indications of the infection, and a scan of my brain showed that everything was fine, and I'm thinking well and not having any brain problems or any reading problems or anything like that. However, some other things happened as a result of that. I started to lose power in my legs, and I fell. Went back to the hospital, and they took me to Stanford, and I could not move my legs or my toes at all. So they put me in an emergency back surgery, and I had 8 I guess, vertebrae fused. And what had happened was that my vertebrae had gone against my spinal cord and pushed it and had affected the nerves. So they did that surgery. So now I have 2 wonderful tungsten rods and screwed in, and cages around spinal cord and everything else. So that was that, and I was told that this infection may have accelerated that process of my legs going out because of the vertebrae disintegrating and so on. And so I got over that and went to rehab, and the rehab was fine. They transferred me to another rehab place. I went to Santa Clara Valley Med, and I can't speak high enough about those folks. Dr. James Crew and his staff, superb. The balcony crash in Berkeley with the Irish students and so on, they sent those girls to Santa Clara Valley Med. Fabulous place, great staff, great doctors. So they sent me there, and then they said, "You're doing so well, we're going to send you to a different place in Mountain View." I was there for 2 days, and I crashed for some reason. They never could figure out, and I was back in the intensive care unit at Valley Med, and all they could figure out was that someone at this other facility had given me the wrong medication or too much medication, and that I basically had an overdose and I didn't know it. But it wasn't anything that I did, it was something that staff did apparently. So I survived that, but I had to start my rehab all over again in terms of walking. I walk reasonably well with a cane. I've graduated from wheelchair to a walker to a cane, which is fine. But that's the story. And And all of this goes back, Steve, to an abscess in a tooth. And I didn't know that I had this abscess. And it was too late when after I found out all the damage had been done. So after they diagnosed me with the infections, they also said, you need to have all your teeth pulled, which was another painful event. So that's the saga of...
How are you now?
I'm much better now. I'm getting strength back and trying to gain some weight back. I feel good. I'm optimistic, and I enjoy being at Sequoia. It's just enlivening and good to be back.
Oh, you know, we enjoy having you. I guess we're here at the end. Do you have any final words, final thoughts to impart to viewers, our kids?
Well, to our students, and I tell them this, so I'll tell them again. I tell them, I say, be curious. Manage your time, because they need to pay more attention to time, especially when they're doing their research projects. Manage your time, be curious, be committed, be consistent, and above all, be kind.
Beautiful, thank you. And you are all of those things. Florian, Mr. Shasky, thank you so much for
Thank you,
this.
Steve. It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye. Always.
Bye.